think the Venice Biennial is, because it was established in 1895, the oldest, like the mother of all biennials, and I think it's still the most relevant ones. Of course, there is the specificity of the biennial that it's driven by national pavilions, and I think in this regard it creates or addresses different questions than other biennials. I wasn't so interested in raising the issue of nationalism. I was more interested in creating or using the opportunity with the Swiss Pavilion to create something specific and also to address the specificity of the context, the pavilion. And it was more like a coincidence that I stumbled across the fact or the footnote that Alberto Giacometti, who is notably the most important Swiss artist of the 20th century, he never showed his work in the Swiss Pavilion that was built by his brother Bruno in 1952. And it felt like the perfect project to create like a point of view or like an angle to create like a narrative and to go from there and using it as a starting point.
When we first began talking with Philipp about ideas for what we could develop here, we were talking about Giacometti, we were talking about the history of this place, and the layers of history here was a trigger. And certainly the trigger for the film installation Flora and the trigger for Bust came from reading about Giacometti and this dismissive mention of a woman called Flora Mayo. And specifically for me, when I was reading James Lord's biography, where he writes that you can tell from looking at a very poor quality, a very blurry photograph, that Flora Mayo, who's pictured sitting next to Giacometti and the artwork she made of him, he describes Flora, he says that there's something weak in her face, and you can see that in the photograph. And I just remember looking at that and thinking, wait a second, that can't be right. And from that moment on, Alexander and I, we wanted to know, who was this woman? Who was she really? Or what happened to her? It's something that, despite all the art historical work that's been done about Giacometti, until now, nobody has discovered what we've discovered.
Flora Mayo was born in Denver, Colorado in 1898. She was wealthy. Her father owned a department store, and eventually she wanted to be an artist. She eventually went to Paris, and in Paris she was engaged. She was at the Académie Grand Tremier, where she met Alberto Giacometti. They both were students, and they had a love relationship ongoing for about 8 years. And during this time, she made a bust of him, and he made a bust of her. Now, the bust of her is called Tête de Femme, Flora Mayo, and the bust that she made of him did not survive because she destroyed all her work by 1933. So we reconstructed this bust as part of this work that we do for the Swiss Pavilion. It was never published that Flora Mayo did not have only one child, but she had 2 children, and eventually we were searching for her second child. We found her second child that was still alive, David Mayo, which plays a big part in the story about finding out who actually is Flora Mayo.
Do you know that I'm supposed to have a Russian soul? I was told I could have stepped out of the cherry orchard. I was headstrong, impulsive, and romantic, and in many ways a bit of a savage. There are reasons for that.
The film installation Flora is based on the relationship between the son and the mother, but at the moment when you encounter it, when you watch the installation, the son is 81 years old and the mother is 25 years old, and they seem to talk to each other. And we very early on structured it as an impossible conversation.
She had a hard life. She knew him when she was in France. And that's about all I ever heard about Giacometti. She didn't really talk about her past.
We want that when a viewer is putting the pieces of the story together, that they're sensing that there are things that can't be seen because there's always one side that you're not seeing. And even when you go back and forth, there are, hopefully for us, gaps and questions that we leave space for the viewer to fill in.
I can't express how much of I was delighted to see that my mother would get some recognition.
With this steel sculpture that I'm working with, you have a visceral sense of the sculpture, and it feels very bodily, but you also have an intellectual sense of the sculpture, and those two things aren't actually separate. Something like a cognitive dissonance that you have with seeing that something looks soft but knowing that it's hard sets those two senses into a kind of dynamic interplay. With the artworks that I'm showing at the Pavilion, I'm using steel in different ways. So I have both bricolage and engineered steel, and steel that's worked with that is manipulated in my studio, and steel that has been fabricated outside of the studio to my specifications, and steel that I've found at the scrapyard. I'm interested in the way that even in an abstract sculpture that is a single material, that there can be so much narrative space. I have one work in the exhibition that's collaged with these three types of techniques, where it's found, manipulated, and fabricated, joined together in a collaged way. And the different textures, the different processes are sitting together, I think, very uncomfortably. Very rough element that looks very distressed. It's been through something, so it's sort of like expressive, but maybe not emotional. But it's expressing something about, you know, just survival or violence. The yellow element, I think, it's very illusionistic. It looks like it's soft, like maybe it's made out of something that you could just grab and manipulate. Maybe it's looks more like plastic or rubber. So I think that can talk about just the power of illusion. Then there's the fabricated element that looks like kind of a UFO. In some ways it's kind of like a linguistic element, like it looks like a stupid punctuation, that it's like language. It could also looks like just other. Our art experience that I can get excited about is one where we encounter a paranormal object. So it's like something that doesn't belong here. And so you have this kind of experience like a tear in reality. It's like a wrongness.
You can say her work addresses Giacometti in a very loose way, but in a very profound ontological way, focusing on the late work while Teresa and Alexander are bracketing the story with the narrative mindset in the early years of his career in the mid-20s. I hope that visitors understand, A, that history needs to be rephrased and rewritten constantly, and I hope that they understand that it's a non-didactic way of addressing the context.